Thank you. Thanks very much, everybody. Can I get a show of hands of who wasn't here last night? Oh my goodness. Okay, great. So I had planned to recap a little what we were doing last night. So that seems like good planning. Basically, I thought we'd begin by recapping some of the main ideas from last night, and then, as I did last night, preview for you the main conclusions to which this line of research has led me, rather starkly put, perhaps a little less starkly than last night. Last night's discussion helped me make them a little clearer for you, perhaps. And then recap some of the insights that I think we can learn from the Kaiser Permanente case we discussed last night, just very briefly, before diving into Toyota. And in particular, I'll be talking about a plant that they had in Northern California, the Newman plant. But before I begin, let me reiterate my thanks to my colleagues here at Saïd for inviting me. It's really truly an honor to be here. My colleagues, Dean Tufano, Richard Whittington, Chris McKenna, David Barron, and Mark Ventresca, who's just back from California. Thank you so much for the invitation. And David Musson at OUP, thank you all so much for the honor that you've bestowed on me by asking me to come and give these lectures. It's a great privilege, and I'm delighted to be here. Present some of the ideas from my research, in some ways a recapitulation of some of the research I've done over the years, but also if sometimes I sound as if I might be out of my depth, that's because I probably am. I'm trying to reach to some new conclusions that will be perhaps a little more controversial. So the general theme of my research has been on large firms, and in particular those that take what I've been calling, for want of a better word, the high road. So large firms, because notwithstanding a lot of the stuff we read in the business press, I do think they are the center of our economies and are likely to stay so for a long time. I don't see in the data much evidence that the balance of firm size distribution is shifting significantly. And the great new startups arising in the tech centers of the world seem to want nothing better than to become great behemoths and just displace the existing ones. So I think the organizational challenges that these large organizations pose to us are going to be with us for a long time, and it behooves us therefore to understand what's happening in their midst to help them manage the complexity and the competitive challenges that they face. I'm particularly interested in the high road ones, as I explained last night. My understanding of the broader trajectory of capitalist development suggests to me that capitalism begins with a process that some people call extensive accumulation, essentially reaching out into underutilized resources of land, labor, savings, snapping up what you might think of as low-hanging fruit. As time progresses, as industry develops, the opportunities for such low-hanging fruit seem to recede. Firms have to have recourse to more intensive modes of capital accumulation. Those take typically, broadly speaking, two forms. An ugly form, you might call it, of simply squeezing the existing resources harder, intensifying work, pressuring workers to work more for less, pressuring suppliers to deliver more for lower prices. And then the more creative path that I'm calling the high road, where the organizations summon up their employees' creativity and intelligence, mobilize their suppliers' creativity and intelligence, and bring to bear the knowledge that is forthcoming from these employees and suppliers to shift the production possibilities frontier. So I'm interested in those firms, the large firms, pursuing that high road, trying to leverage their employees and suppliers' knowledge and creativity. None of us need reminding, but I may as well remind us anyway, that the news is full of the other firms, the low-road firms. There's so many of them that fill the front pages of our newspapers, and it's pretty distressing to see how these organizations thrive. Nevertheless, amongst these organizations, there are, amongst the universe of organizations, there are plenty of others who are trying to take the high road, and therefore it behooves us to understand what they're doing to meet the challenges that they face. The propositions I wanted to put to you let me jump to the propositions, and then we'll come back and recap the lessons from the Kaiser Permanente case. The first couple simply assert that in broad outlines, I think I've stumbled across or found a way to articulate three kinds of organizing principles that seem to help these high road firms deal with the challenges they face. Scalable value rationality helps them deal with the complexities of planning in these larger, more complex firms. Enabling bureaucracy helps them deal with the challenge of efficiency foisted on them by vigorous competition. And what I'll call collaborative community, I think, helps them deal more effectively with the challenges of innovation. In each of these lectures, as you can see, I'll be trying to dig deeper into one of these principles. They all overlap to some extent, so there's a little bit of redundancy. Hope not so much as to waste the time of folks who show up more than one evening. The implementation of these principles is difficult, and I'll try to convince you that the implementation, the effective implementation, the durable implementation of these principles requires a shift in the basic structure of the enterprise from a more capitalistic paradigm to a more socialist paradigm. By socialist, I will try to abstract from the sorry history of the erstwhile socialist bloc countries, the sorry history of their relatively ineffectual enterprises, and try to focus on the underlying idea, the concept. And the concept is familiar to you all. It's essentially cooperation within the firm in lieu of the wage relationship, where workers forego their discretion and their autonomy in exchange for a wage and accept taking direction from a manager. And then between firms, in lieu of competition governing relations between firms on markets, a relationship of cooperation and planned production, aiming to meet social needs rather than the imperative for profit maximization that drives individual firms in that competitive space, where even if they wanted to pay more attention to social and environmental values, unless those contributed to their profitability performance, they risk being driven out of business by their low-road competitors. This shift towards a socialist end of the spectrum, if I manage to convince you that there's any such thing going on in these companies, is obviously puzzling, because we know a lot about why socialism seems like a rather awkward formula to adopt. Especially in a building named after Lady Thatcher, it seems appropriate to remind ourselves and take seriously, I think, I'd like to take seriously the objections that people have advanced against the socialist idea. Planning at a large scale of economic affairs seems destined to slide into an authoritarian kind of despotic model. Come on down. The efficiency in a socialist paradigm is not an obvious accomplishment. If workers manage cooperatives, setting their own pace and form of work, one might wonder how much efficiency will be forthcoming in these socialist cooperative enterprises. And then the socialistic enterprise model would seem to presume a pretty high level of collectivism in people's values, not obvious where the kind of individual creativity is going to come from to drive innovation in a socialist model. My argument's going to be that one of the very interesting things happening in these firms as they attempt to implement these new organizing principles, and in order to do so shift in the direction of a more socialistic structure, they discover that those principles are the solutions to those dilemmas of socialism. They discover that scalable value rationality, enabling bureaucracy, and collaborative community are in fact remedies to the likely deficiencies of the socialist model. In this way, I'm going to argue that these organizations preview for us what I've been calling, perhaps a little provocatively, high-performance socialism. It's a model that I think we do well to ponder. It might become perhaps a model for a broader societal transformation. The broader societal transformation seems an important issue for us to address, because this high-performance socialist model is not likely to diffuse very far in a broadly capitalist environment. The low-road competitors at home or abroad are likely to push such organizations off the high road, force them to have recourse to low-road type strategies themselves. And this model is not going to survive very well in a capitalistic environment. The only way to make it the norm, to make it the way business operates, would be to foreclose the low road altogether. And I'll just simply assert, and happy to engage the discussion with you, that the prospects of a regulated capitalism, social democracy style, doing that in a durable way, have been demonstrated historically to be zero. Much as we might feel some enthusiasm for the idea of restoring a degree of regulation in our industry to foreclose the low-road options, We know all too well from the history of the last 100 years that efforts to regulate that way are likely to provoke counter-movements. The famous Polanyi double movement goes both ways, ladies and gentlemen. And historically, and every time we've seen a progression of social democratic regulation, we've also seen a counter-movement, and that has been the main wave of the last 30, 40 years in our countries. I therefore postulate that it's a more radical fundamental transformation at societal level of a socialistic kind that would take these planning principles, cooperative principles to the societal level that would be necessary to generalize this high-performance model of socialism. That in turn leads me to the last conclusion, the last proposition here, which is where the hell are the forces likely to drive such a radical transformation at the societal level, you might well ask. And I don't claim to have the answer to it, but I do want to suggest to you, and that'll be the final point of the presentations, that the experience of work in these high-performance socialist systems, as I'm calling them, or in these high-end firms, does a great deal to stimulate the emergence of a cognitive horizons, social capacities amongst working people that can fuel the movement towards socialism at a broader societal political level. Last night I offered that proposition without offering any evidence whatsoever for it. Tonight I hope, if I move fast enough, we'll have a chance to explore some of the evidence for that. Anecdotal, entirely anecdotal though it might be, as I see it being played out at this NUMMI plant. In summary, my arguments are not at all of the kind that I'm going to be able to offer you any rigorous statistical demonstration for. This is more in the vein of a kind of interpretive framework that I'm offering you. But let's dive on into it, and you'll see where that takes us and have a chance to throw your rocks and tomatoes at it as we go. As I said, 3 principles that we'll look at in these 3 cases. The cases seem to me to be germane. The industries are industries in which these problems are respectively very central problems. Planning at large scale seems like a crucial issue in the healthcare arena. That's why I chose the Kaiser Permanente case, one of the major healthcare leaders in the United States. Efficiency seems to be rather important in the automobile industry, shall we say. It remains a central factor in competitiveness there, so that seems like a good place to study one of the leading firms in that industry. And then for innovation, I've chosen to focus on people in the software services sector, and we'll come back tomorrow and talk about that. Last night, we talked about the idea of scaling value rationality at Kaiser Permanente, and the bottom line to the argument was that planning on a large scale of economic affairs is difficult. It poses problems of legitimacy in the kinds of decisions being made in planning such large, complex ensembles. The capitalist solution to such challenges to legitimacy is to rely on the kind of legitimacy the bureaucratic authority and market competitiveness might offer the senior leaders of the firm in directing the rest of the organization to follow their plan. That's not negligible. That legitimacy is not an altogether hopeless reed on which to hang this enterprise, but it's a rather weak one. It generates, as we know, many of you have studied, problems of organizational change and strategy implementation in large organizations. The resistance from everybody from the executive suite down is perennial and a perennial problem. I suggested that Kaiser Permanente had found a way to overcome this by developing a bunch of technologies, or managerial technologies, for scaling up the principle of value rationality so that the ideas like collegiality could really take grip over a large collectivity, 100,000, 150,000 people, 17,000 doctors, that all seem to be miraculously coordinated in their commitment to improving performance on clinical and efficiency level in the Kaiser system. Mainly there, we focused on a hierarchy of management and labor partnership relationships from the board level right down to through the state level, down to the facility level, and down to the operating unit level. A system that I'll come back and talk a bit more about perhaps tomorrow. You might call it democratic centralization. We also talked about a range of techniques that the company there used to link the general purposes of Kaiser Permanente to the daily work of people at the operating level. This, I argued, I offered a little bit of evidence to the idea that Kaiser, in order to implement this concept, had to adopt something more socialistic by way of a basic structure to its enterprise. Tonight, we'll turn to Toyota, and I'll make a parallel set of arguments. Efficiency, I will argue, in large-scale organizations, requires a fair bit of rigorous standardization of the way we do things. In a capitalist enterprise, the solution to that challenge of getting workers to commit to operating in a highly standardized, if you will, regimented manner is to leverage the power of the legitimacy of the bureaucratic authority structure in the enterprise. I pay you your wage in order that you obey my orders, and if I tell you your task will be 60 seconds long and we'll proceed in such and such a manner, then if you want that wage, you do what I tell you to do. It doesn't work too badly, although it did bring back to mind some of the limits to this kind of bureaucratic authority. You might remember the Charlie Chaplin movie, and poor Charlie Chaplin's being harangued here by his foreman for not keeping up the pace on the assembly line. It doesn't seem to work brilliantly as a way of assuring world-class levels of efficiency. The socialist model has typically been interpreted as, the alternative there has typically been interpreted as posing something of a problem for efficiency, because indeed, as I mentioned earlier, if workers are running enterprises as cooperatives, it's quite hard to see how they would rigorously impose such regimentation on their own work processes. And indeed, we've got some interesting models of an alternative. Some of you may be familiar with Volvo's Uddevalla plant, back in the 1980s, where they ripped up the assembly line altogether. Or actually never installed it. It was a brand new plant, and instead had teams of 8, 9, 10 workers each building the entire car, or at least half a car, up from the components upwards. It proved not to be very efficient. It proved to be so poorly functioning in terms of efficiency and kind of conformance quality that they could not keep the plant going. So I'm going to talk with you today about Toyota. And in particular the plant that they ran in Northern California, the NUMMI plant, which is a much more conventional assembly line. If you looked closely at this picture, I might be able to highlight for you some distinctively Toyota approaches to workstation design. But essentially what I'd like to do is walk through Toyota's experience to make the argument that they've developed an approach to the challenge of efficiency, one I'm calling enabling bureaucracy, that squares this circle. So NUMMI, let me give you a little bit of background on NUMMI. NUMMI is the New United Motor Manufacturing Incorporated, a joint venture of General Motors and Toyota, created after General Motors' plant in Fremont, Northern California, was shut down in 1982, laying off about nearly 6,000 workers in the process. It was a plant renowned for antagonistic labor relations, amongst other problems. Quality in the plant was atrocious, productivity well below the GM norm, which those of you who know anything about the auto industry know that that's a pretty bad record, pretty difficult record to break, being below the GM norm. Drug use, rampant in the organization. I'm told you could buy any drugs you wanted any time of the day or night out in the parking lot, and that's not where they were consumed. They were consumed in the bathrooms, and so typically workers you were advised not to buy a car produced in the second shift. Or the second half of any given shift after lunch, not a good idea. So NUMMI takes over this plant, not really because they wanted to, but they needed a plant in North America. They decided to team up with General Motors. General Motors only offered them this plant to restart. Because it had been a UAW plant, Toyota had no option but to work with the UAW. The UAW essentially forced them to rehire all the workers who wanted to be rehired in that plant. So all the same, lots of radicals from Berkeley to set up shop in the NUMMI plant in order to join the working class in its struggle. It was a quite challenging plant to manage, as you might imagine. The Toyota ran the plant. General Motors essentially just took some of their product and invested the plant, didn't invest any of its own cash. Toyota ran the plant under Toyota production system principles, quite rigorously trying to implement them in the US with very few changes. Some of their other human resource management practices were changed as vis-a-vis their Toyota practices in Japan, but the production system core, these features of the way the plant operated, were quite rigorously copied from the Toyota plants in Japan. I want to focus on the last element, standardized work, which looks a bit like this. You probably can't read it, but basically what you've got here is a breakdown of about 60 seconds worth of work into about 17 tasks. The worker is, let's see, the car is moving along the assembly line down here. The parts are in a bin over here, and these lines trace the movement of the worker back and forth between the parts bin and the car and some tooling that they're going to use here. In the left-hand column, we have a breakdown of the number of seconds required for each of the tasks. And then in these other little cells down here, this is the walk time between the tasks. So we have a total of 32 seconds of work time, 22 seconds of walking time for 54 seconds of total activity. Toyota says, let's put our minds to rationalizing this, and lo and behold, after this analysis, we've rationalized the flow of the movement of the worker between the car and the parts tables and so forth. We've got down from whatever it was, down to 29 seconds, 12 seconds, a total of 41 seconds. 41 seconds in a 60-second cycle time gives the worker 20 seconds for a nice breather, take a cigarette. No way. This is Toyota. We load you up with about another 15 seconds or so of work. Toyota aims to occupy the worker about 57 seconds out of 60 on the average work cycle. And in practice, in the old GM Fremont plant, the worker was working approximately 35 seconds out of 60. So no wonder the plant is more efficient, you might tell me. I will generalize from this little snippet of the reality of NUMMI to make a more general argument that NUMMI represents a highly bureaucratic organization. Bureaucratic in the technical sense of the word, with which many of you are familiar. A high degree of standardization, and that's just what we saw. This standardization is not just tacit shared understandings about the way we do things, it's formalized, it's written down. The organization is a little less specialized in some respects. They had just 2 categories of skilled trade workers rather than 18. For the main part, though, in reality, it's much the same degree of specialization of tasks as you would find in the old GM plant. The hierarchical differentiation of the organization, interestingly, was even more elaborate than at General Motors. There were more layers of management between the frontline worker and the senior manager at NUMMI than there were in the old GM Fremont plant at the same size. And then in terms of staffs, very big staffs, powerful staffs in human resources, production control, quality engineering. We know something about the likelihood of different kinds of outcomes associated with a highly bureaucratic organization. And indeed, we find at NUMMI some degree of conformance to our expectations. The process was very efficient. As we said, moving from 35 seconds every 60 of real work up to 57, that's likely to generate some improved productivity. The quality of the vehicle dramatically improved. Within a couple of years, Newmont is producing at almost the same level of efficiency and quality as the plant in Toyota back in Japan on which they were modeled, the Takaoka plant, which is said to be, at the time, the most efficient, highest quality plant in the world. Not a bad accomplishment for the same set of workers rehired under now Toyota management. I should have said, General Motors had no operating managers in the plant. They had a little office that studied what was going on, but they had no managerial authority in the plant whatsoever. Now, let's ask, what about the quality of workers' experience of this? Right? We come to this little sketch that I've given you with some degree of hesitation about what this might be like as a plant to work in. I offer you 3 pieces of evidence to the effect that draw me to the conclusion that workers experience their work in this plant in a rather positive, very positive way. Suggestions per worker. I had some data on this. Where did I put this? Participation in the suggestion program. Remember, I mentioned Kaizen on this list of elements of the Toyota production. Kaizen means continuous improvement through suggestions. The proportion of workers in 1986 participating in any way in the Kaizen program, the suggestion program, was 26%. 6 years later, it was up at 94% of workers in the plant were suggesting at least 1 suggestion per year. And on average, that was 6 suggestions per worker per year. You're not obliged to make suggestions. The monetary remuneration for making these suggestions, I believe, at the time averaged about $25 per suggestion. This is not going to buy you a couple of beers across the street, not much more. Satisfaction surveys, pretty unreliable index, but they showed remarkably high levels of satisfaction with work at NUMMI. And then I like the bathroom walls test. If you went into the bathrooms at Toyota, at NUMMI at the time, maybe you had a chance to visit. Maybe the women's bathrooms are different, but the men's bathrooms are usually quite eloquent about the way workers feel about their bosses and their working conditions. And I did get a chance to go into the bathrooms. I was astonished. They had not been scrubbed clean every 24 hours. There just wasn't any negative crap on the walls. It was quite impressive. So why do we have such a positive reaction of workers to such an incredibly regimented, demanding degree of discipline in the operation of the daily work tasks? One factor you might say is that workers were rehired. They'd been laid off from General Motors. It was quite traumatic. Just being rehired, there would have been a huge sigh of relief. You might have imagined some goodwill forthcoming from the workers under those circumstances. But I ask you to conduct this thought experiment. If they'd gone back into General Motors Fremont, with the same General Motors managers and management practices, do you think we would have seen these results 5 and 8 and 10 years later? No way. It would have very quickly resumed the General Motors pattern of quality, productivity, drug use, and so forth. No, I think the essential issue here pertains to the way the jobs were designed, the way the work was actually designed. I mentioned that there was an incredible degree of standardization and formalization. The thing that I didn't mention was that it were workers themselves who were analyzing their jobs, doing those standardized work charts. Beside every workstation, you found one of these standardized work charts. It was the workers themselves who were taught how to use a stopwatch, how to work together in their work team, to time each other, to work out what the best way of doing the task was, how to do the task most efficiently, with the highest quality, and most safely for the worker. Rick Madrid, one of the workers I interviewed, said this to me: the General Motors system of job design relied on authority. People with rank, the managers, ruled regardless of their competence or the validity of what they were saying. It was basically a military hierarchy. At NUMMI, rank doesn't mean a damn thing. Standardized work means we all work out the objectively best way to do the job, and everyone does it that way. I might make some minor adjustments because of my height. He was a pretty big, short guy. But I follow the procedure we've laid out because it makes sense. Management's delegated responsibility to people who do the work, and that gives workers a sense of pride in their job. Let me move very quickly through what could be a much longer discussion, and I will just draw this conclusion from what we've just seen. The way we normally think of organization design options, I think it's fair to say, array them across the diagonal of this chart, as between more organic, congenial, informal organizations, low on bureaucracy, and mechanistic bureaucratic structures on the bottom left here, coercive in nature. The more routine the task, we teach our students in our organization design classes, the more routine the task, the more bureaucracy we need, the more discipline, regimentation, formalization, standardization, specialization we need. Okay? And therefore, routine operations, by necessity, if they are to achieve this efficiency they need to adopt this coercive mechanistic kind of model. This contrast is a long-standing one in our field, and I'll put to you that it's a truncated one. There are, I will argue, two kinds of bureaucracies, and organizations like Toyota have articulated for us, or brought forward for us, right, the idea that bureaucracy comes in these two very different kinds. I'll call them coercive and enabling. All of these technologies of bureaucracy can be deployed to support worker initiative, creativity, and intelligence. If standardization helps identify improvement opportunities rather than reducing the discretion of the employee. If the formalization, writing it down, serves to support memory and sharing rather than simply make it easier for a boss to blame the workers when things screw up. If specialization is designed to enable workers to deepen their expertise. If the hierarchy, as I said, a very finely graduated hierarchy, is used to facilitate coaching by managers of their subordinates, that changes the meaning of hierarchy. And indeed at Toyota, one of the key skills of any manager is teaching subordinates. And I don't know very many American firms, maybe it's more common in England, I don't know very many firms where managers at every level are taught how to teach and are evaluated on their teaching effectiveness, and where they have master teachers, people who are experts in teaching other teachers. That's seen as a core part of the managerial hierarchy's role. So you get my drift. So I think we need a broader spectrum. I think Toyota teaches us that there's a broader spectrum of opportunities in the organization design space. The autocratic alternative we're all too familiar with. We don't talk much about it in our organization design classes, but it's a pretty important option out there. But I think this enabling bureaucracy principle suggests that there's another way to do things. I would make one other observation about this, which is that this enabling bureaucracy idea helps us understand something interesting about Toyota, which is not just that workers seem to be remarkably dedicated to fulfilling this standardized work process, but that they participate in actively improving their work. Right? Many organizations across the United States try to implement the idea of quality circles so as to mobilize workers' creativity and intelligence. So you'd work on the assembly line for 8 hours, and at the end of the shift, you'd come into the team room and they'd give you a pizza and they'd ask you to brainstorm to come up with better ways to do things. You treat me in this coercive, mechanistic, autocratic manner, or let's say coercive manner. You treat me as an idiot and a robot for 8 hours, and then you want to give me a pizza and ask for my intelligence and creativity. Not surprisingly, all of these quality circles failed. You turn to Toyota, you treat work, so that's oil and water, if you will, right? You turn to Toyota, You treat me with dignity, with respect. You respect my intelligence during that 8-hour shift on the assembly line, and now you take me into a quality circle and ask me to bring forth new ideas about how we can improve things. Now we can talk. Now we've got a deal. So let's go back to my broader argument, if you will. Forgive me for how brief this little window of visibility into the Toyota operation has been. Many of you in the room know far more about it, and will have to challenge me if you think my little representation of Toyota is simply out of whack and I'm betraying something important about the way this organization works. But this is what I learned studying them in a more capsule form. So let me go back to the general argument about the idea that these enabling bureaucracy practices require a shift in the basic structure, the basic paradigm of enterprise towards a more socialist form. Workers' power at NUMMI is crucial. I set up here something about trust and community. Not sure they're exactly the right words. We'll talk more about them tomorrow. But there's something going on about trust and community that's differentiating the left-hand side and the right-hand side of this chart. If you want that sense of trust and community, much easier to get it if the people you're asking to trust you as managers have some power in that relationship. Trust without power is a pretty weak tool. Workers at NUMMI had real power. The UAW was powerfully implanted in the organization. Toyota had agreed to empower the union further by drawing them into a partnership relationship. There were regular meetings at NUMMI. It doesn't quite have the density of partnership that we saw yesterday at Kaiser Permanente, but it was nevertheless very powerful. Workers, senior union leadership and management met regularly to review production plans, plans for new models, plans for new production technology, plans for changes to the way the plant was operating, and right down to the departmental level. Union people were in constant dialogue with their management counterparts. Workers also had the benefit of a very powerful no layoff commitment. The Kaizen improvements that they brought to bear on their work, management committed that if they were to free up any labor resources, right, those people would be redeployed, they would find other work for them, if necessary, retraining them. That's interesting. I slipped one. Where did I go here? Oh, there was another one that I wanted to say. There's something about, well, maybe I'll find it. I can do this. There we go. There it is. The second element, I think, that speaks to a shift in a more socialist direction is the workers' conviction that they were dealing with a management that cared about the quality of the product. One of the other workers I interviewed there said, we want to be proud of our cars. We don't need to hear any crap about how a neighbor bought one of our cars and was built on a Friday or Monday, how it's falling apart. At NUMMI, we finally found a management whose goals were compatible with ours. Build a quality product and provide stable employment. The US companies would never say that. They only have one goal, stockholder value. As long as they think that way, industrial relations have to be adversarial. So point number one on this broader question of a shift towards a more socialistic kind of, oops, where we go, we're going to get to Mari in a second, shift towards this more socialistic structure of enterprise relations. In the internal relations within the organization, labor is no longer a mere commodity to hire and fire. It has some standing in the organization. It is a partner with management in the organization, and therefore I would argue we're seeing something of a shift from that left-hand side towards the right-hand side of my slide here. The other part of this socialist concept that I introduced earlier on was the idea of cooperation rather than competition between firms. And I think Toyota is very interesting in this respect too. Yesterday, when we talked about Kaiser Permanente, I pointed out how interesting it was, how important it was for the effectiveness of Kaiser Permanente, that they had brought together 17,000 doctors as part of the Permanente medical groups, and that they were no longer individual entrepreneurs competing with each other, gently, because they're professionals, guild-like, because they're professionalized, but that competition of guild-like monopoly and competition amongst physicians is pretty catastrophic for the quality of healthcare, or it has been in the United States. That bringing them together under one organization has been a very powerful factor. I think in the case of Toyota, bringing together Toyota with its suppliers has been also very powerfully important, and that's why I'm a little nervous about talking about this, because this used to be Mari's area of specialization. But I would say Mari's work on the level of trust required to sustain these kinds of learning relationships between Toyota and its suppliers also draw us from the more capitalistic, purely competitive grounds of relationships between enterprises to a more cooperative, planful interaction amongst firms from the left, therefore, to the right-hand side of my capitalist to socialist paradigms slide. Jeff Dye has done a lot of work on supplier networks and the kind of learning that Toyota manages to get through these networks, and the power of the creativity, when you can mobilize the creativity and intelligence of your suppliers through these high trust relationships that Mari documented in her work on these issues many years ago now. The supplier associations that bring Toyota together with all its suppliers, Toyota's commitment to developing expertise that it gives its suppliers and helping them, going into their plants to help them renovate, improve the quality of their work in those plants. And then teams amongst suppliers themselves, the suppliers themselves get together with some Toyota people to work on problems that are specific to those groups of suppliers. This is a pretty phenomenal degree of cooperation, replacing what in the General Motors and Ford and many other automobile companies is a very adversarial, arm's length, competitive relationship. And the point I suppose I wanted to make is, and this is extending your work maybe too far, Mari, I think that there is less in Japan, but more in the United States and outside of Japan, relations between an automobile manufacturer like Toyota and its suppliers is documented in a contract. There's a considerable literature in our field that has argued that contracts tend to displace trust. I think that's just poppycock. Contracts can reflect high levels or low levels of trust. You have to read the contract. You have to look at the relationship to discover what role they're playing. And at Toyota, when you look at the way they write their contracts with their suppliers, you see many of these bureaucratic features embedded in the contracts, but serving this enabling, learning-oriented, joint learning purpose. So there too, I think, both in the external relations between firms and in the internal relations within Toyota itself, within NUMI itself, you've got relationships that start to look a lot like a shift, significant shift in that socialistic direction. So let's note that this is a precarious accomplishment. In this case, I don't need to argue too far. NUMI ended up getting shut down. It got shut down because General Motors went into bankruptcy and pulled out of the joint venture. At which point Toyota was holding the bag for this plant. Toyota too was in a situation of dramatic overcapacity. And in the name of Toyota's profitability, sorry guys, we're going to shut down the plant. Notwithstanding the no layoff proposition, they weren't laid off because workers had worked themselves out of the job with all these Kaiser, and they were laid off because in the bigger scheme of things, Toyota didn't really feel like they needed this plant. They would rather expand their plant in Ontario or Kentucky than reinvest in this plant and try to make it a productive asset for them. So profitability prevailed in the end there too. I won't speak too much about Toyota's other problems with safety. The less said about that, the better. So where are we in my little sequence of propositions here? What I wanted to say was that it is difficult to see how the existence of low-road competitors doesn't continuously jeopardize the stability of these new models of organization that I've been talking about. It is difficult to see how some modest degree of regulation, some plausible degree of regulation, could enable this model to become the norm across industry. When those low-road competitors, whether they're within the US or domestically, or whether they're overseas competitors who are benefiting from some of the advantages of underexploited labor, land, and savings resources, those low-road competitors threaten the viability of this new model. I will therefore assert, as I said, not much argumentation behind it, that it needs a more thoroughgoing socialistic transformation of the economy if we're going to make these, block the low road, bar the low road in a more durable, sustainable fashion. So then the question I began with, where are the forces likely to support such a transformation going to come from? And I promised you to say a few words about the kinds of changes that workers at NUMI have experienced that I think, to my eyes, make them pretty compelling subjects for a powerful political movement. I have no idea what political organization would be required to mobilize them with that capacity, to mobilize that capacity to effective political ends. That is not my proposal to you today. I don't have anything to say really about that. I did promise to talk about it over a beer sometime if people are interested, but not my scholarly arena. But I can say something about the transformation of workers' abilities, their cognitive horizons, their outlook on the world. And let me just, in these last few minutes, give you a few glimpses of some of the ways in which these workers have talked about the change they experienced. And then I ask you to think about these workers' willingness to participate in some broader transformation of society that goes beyond the defense of their own direct material interests and that speaks to the need to a societal transformation. So let's just take a few of them. A training. At NUMI, I'm constantly learning new things. Right now, I'm part of the 1989 NOVA model project team. The homework, the extra work's rough, but it's exciting to be constantly tackling new problems. At GM, they left me in the truck tire mounting department for 8 years of mind-numbing repetition. It was great. This is a guy that spent 8 years mounting the left rear wheel on trucks. That's all he did. You know, huge guy. You can imagine the muscles he built up. That's all he did for 8 years. And now he's part of a team of 20 workers who are planning the introduction of a whole new model into the plant, who are meeting with suppliers, meeting with engineers. He's learning new things. We really need a union production system committee to study all these issues. People from the plant who understand them and have the time to work on them. The old approach, the old union approach, was simpler. You make the damn decision, you managers make the damn decision, and I'll grieve it if I want. Now we need to understand how the production system works. We need to take the time to analyze things, to formulate much more detailed counter-proposals to management. This system really allows us to take as much power as we know what to do with. We don't have the expertise yet, but a hunger to get it. For 23 years working for General Motors, I never met with a supplier. I never even knew their names except for the names on the boxes. Now we're working with suppliers to improve our products. Workers sit down with our engineers and managers and the suppliers people, and we analyze defects and development improvement proposals. We even do that with equipment vendors. Stuff like that really gives us a better perspective on how our jobs relate to the whole process. We're not just drilling holes and slamming nuts onto bolts anymore. Now we have a say in how the product should be made. So these connections between the firm and its suppliers are not just at the senior management level or the supplier engineer level or the procurement manager level. They're down at the shop floor level. And some of these suppliers are overseas. So now you have these American workers in Northern California who have never been outside Northern California, right? In talking by Skype or email with suppliers in other parts of the world. And then finally, I'd just say, firstly, drug use had almost disappeared in the plant. It's a pretty interesting form of therapy if you think of kind of social intervention to attack a rampant drug problem in a community, giving people better work. Interesting idea. I haven't heard it much discussed in policy circles. But this last one really stuck in my mind a lot too, just to talk about broadening horizons. One of the other workers said to me, I wish you could talk to the guys' wives about the changes we've seen. Obviously, it's a fella, right? We had many women working in the plant. They had interesting things to say too, but for the men, I wish you could talk to the guys' wives about the changes they've seen. I was a typical macho horse's ass when I worked at GM Fremont. When I got home, I'd get a beer, put my feet up and wait for dinner to be served. I'd figure, I've done my 8 hours, so leave me alone. Now I'm part of a team at work. I take that attitude home with me rather than dump my work frustrations all over my family. I'm much more of a partner around the house. I help wash the dishes, do the shopping and stuff. My job here is to care. I spend 8 hours a day doing that job, so it's kind of natural I take it home with me. I don't know about you, but I find these very touching. Am I a sucker? Probably I'm a sucker, you know. But man, I talk to workers, whether it's at Kaiser Permanente yesterday or at NUMI, and I hear workers talking like this, and I say, man, I want you on my side when the revolution comes. Because you seem like a really thoughtful person who's kind of just got, you're understanding something about the world. This is not somebody who's just angry at management because they screwed me out of that shift change that I wanted. These are not parochial concerns that typically animate contentious relations between labor and management. These are workers who are thinking hard about the way the world works and how they can contribute to making it better. That seems to me not a bad starting point if you wanted to think about where forces for system-wide socialist change might come from. With that, maybe we can turn to discussion. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. So I'm going to just ask people to identify themselves before they ask the question. anything goes.
I'm Chris Smith. Sorry I was a bit late. Parking in Oxford's a bit hard. I've just driven up from Royal Holloway, University of London. So, Paul, yeah, I hope I caught most of it.
And you've seen it before. So.
Well, I'm not sure if I've seen all of it before, but I mean, I really love the kind of the stories about workers' transformation. And I did work with Tony Elgar on Japanese companies in the UK, and we found exactly the same stories, that there was a sense in which Japanese firms were taking production workers seriously for the first time. The sense of trying to involve them was there, a learning that precisely as you described was there. But, there's always a but.
Thank you.
I think it's overplayed. You are kind of romanticising it to some degree, because obviously the plant shut down. It's in the greater scheme of things. Toyota haven't repeated that model elsewhere. If you look at Toyota plants in China, they're nothing like this. So, okay, we have to then ask the question, was this a specific case? And then you're building from that specific case something rather grand, which there's always contradictions. I'll give you one example with your suggestion scheme, that the idea that workers' suggestions are a sign of their greater involvement. We had that as well at one of our plants. And if you plotted the suggestion schemes across the months, as workers' wages were declining and they were running out of money, they started to increase the number of suggestions, because every suggestion they made, they got £1. So suggestions always increased at the end of the month when their salary was going down. Now, I'm just
when
kind
the bank
of
account was
acting when the regular salary was running out. They were throwing in suggestions so they could get a bit of money. A lot of the suggestions never used.
Interesting. I should say, just on that, at Toyota, at Numi at least, something like 90% of them were actually implemented. Interesting.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think that there was a sense in which the quality circle experience, the suggestion stream experience, that cynical comment maybe, but managers were not always following up on that, and therefore there was a sense of deflation when there wasn't a follow-through in a delivery. But there were many other contradictions. What you're sort of leaving out, the nice story about the supply chain, but there's also a story about squeezing the supply chain. The stress on the core workers, but Toyota factories always have temporary workers, and in many car companies now, this massive expansion of temporary labour is a core feature of what it is to be a production worker. In the China plants especially, there's extensive temporary workers. So it's not the full story, and it's only one case.
Sure.
But it's a nice story.
You're absolutely right. I'm glossing over features of the situation, even at Numi, that might argue in the other direction. But my basic thesis is that workers' experience of this more engaged form of work has them become more demanding of the organizations that they work for. So when managers were managers to pull back, or when managers pull back on that engagement, that partnership, workers' response is not simply is informed by their aspiration to continue that engagement. They're angry that managers are dropping the ball on something that should work, that can work, they've seen work. And I think that's a very different attitude. And I'm not saying that this form of work is becoming universal. I'm just simply saying that when workers have this experience, or when they see other people in their community have that experience in organizations, hear them talking about their work, it raises in their minds the demand for a higher form, a more advanced form of management of the enterprise. And when the enterprise itself is being killed off by low-road competitors, it makes them angry that we're not in a position to block that low road and make these high road patterns of work organisation the norm. And to that extent...
Economic nationalism? Are you talking about kind of blocking off international competition?
Complicated question, to be sure. Some of this low road competition comes from overseas. And it's obviously a struggle within the union movement and progressive political forces over how to frame the defence of whatever advantages they may have developed nationally in blocking off the low road amongst national competition. Complicated question. I don't claim to have a simple answer to it. What I am saying simply is that workers' experience of these, what I'm calling high-performance socialist forms of work organisation, is an experience that delegitimizes in their minds the capitalist model, legitimizes in their mind an alternative socialist model, and equips them in their cognitive capabilities, their social skills, equips them to act in order to change the world to block off that low road. So those are, I don't expect those changes to manifest themselves directly in any short-term way, but I think in the long term they counteract many of the negative corrosive elements that have been weakening forces for socialist change in our societies, the decline of the union movement, the dissipation of support for traditional social democratic parties and so forth. Those are all negatives, if you will, in the balance sheet, but I'm arguing that there's a positive in the balance sheet here, which is workers' experience in these high road firms.
Let's see if we can do without the microphones. If you could speak up a little bit.
Yes, I'll try to do my best. Bureaucracy is a form of routines.
Yes.
And routines by definition are rigid and repetitive, right? So which may be difficult for employees and workers to adopt new ways and abilities that match environmental changes.
Mm-hmm.
In this context, what can be the underlying mechanisms, practices, and processes to sustain this relationship between bureaucracy and efficiency?
Yeah, good question. It turns out NUMI was not only one of the most efficient plants with the highest sort of quality conformance to their, with respect to their existing products, but also one of the most flexible in the speed with which they could adapt it. Every 4 years. They introduced a major new model. The major new model involved typically changing of something like 60% of the parts, something like 60% of the workstations, tools and equipment would be changed. And NUMI was not only the most efficient in that routine, repetitive operation, but was also the most flexible in responding to these major model changes, which is about as radical a change, a radical innovation as an automobile assembly plant needs to accommodate. Honda is similar. Honda is perhaps even more agile in this respect, right? But what they've done is they've developed, to your first point, in their way of thinking, there's routines and then there's routines for changing routines. We know how to, so even the model changes are thoroughly documented. There's a huge documentation for how to manage model changes. So every 4 years when we do this model change, we go back to that documentation. We think about how it should be adjusted to respond to the particularities of this model change. Then we have a review of how well we perform. We have a Kaizen process on the model change process. So they've developed, I think we tend to schematize in our minds this idea that you began with, right? That routines imply some degree of rigidity. I think not. I think routines lead to rigidity when we haven't given ourselves the resources to mobilize those routines for continuous learning. We can marry those routines with all kinds of, if you will, call them meta routines, routines for changing routines, routines for adapting routines, routines for developing new ways of doing things when that proves necessary. I think we tend to, what's the word I'm looking for, caricature the way routinization works, the way bureaucracies work, and assume that any time we've got a high degree of standardization and formalization, that has to create an unacceptable degree of rigidity in the organization. Maybe not a bad generalization, but if you look at the exceptions, you discover that they're not exceptions because they've abandoned standardization, formalization, and routines. They're deploying them in a different way.
Hi, my name is Stefan Jensen. I'm a current MBA student. I'm surprised that you argue that a broader political transformation is needed for this kind of more collaborative model to become the norm, as clearly NUMI was a much more competitive factory than GM Fremont. I think we see this in a lot of fields, that it's actually just better and more profitable and more productive to involve more workers and to have a more collaborative environment.
And so you imagine that because of its high performance, it will become the norm progressively, it will diffuse across the industry or across the economy.
Well, I think that would argue that perhaps it's enough that it is. Well, I mean, if you had GM Vermont and you had Mumme next to each other, which one of them would survive in a competitive market? I mean, probably Mumme. Probably they would outcompete GM Vermont. I think that's the case in a lot of industries.
Sure. So we agree for the main part, but I have two problems. One is that in a market economy, there is a cyclical process of boom and bust, crises that generate massive overcapacity in this industry, and Toyota is not exempt from that. No company competing in a competitive industry can be exempt from the pattern of cyclical boom and bust. And in that bust period, there's no reason to believe that these high-performing firms would be more likely to survive than their low-road competitors. Secondly, the low-road competitors cheat. They externalize their costs. They make other people pay for some of the resources they use. That enables them to outcompete the high-road performers who've essentially internalized many of these social and environmental costs. If that low-road performer, disgusting though their practices may seem to you and me, is actually growing faster and throwing off more profits for its investors, where do you think the investors are going to put their money? In the nice guys or the successful guys?
Externalizing costs be independent of the way they organize the work internally in the plant or in the firm?
So my story about the shift to a socialistic kind of infrastructure for the enterprise, I think captures some of the idea that these enterprises are essentially taking more responsibility, at least for the social. We haven't talked about the environmental issues, but the social costs are there internalized. They're not relying, as I said, the low-road firms are typically relying on underexploited labor resources. So they go to China and they employ migrant workers, fresh to the city, who are willing to work for almost nothing. Well, that's a form of exploitation which works for a while, but which wreaks havoc on the people that are trying to pay workers the kinds of wages, cultivate the kinds of skills that warrant those wages. But if you can produce a car, even if it's not such a great one, at a much, much lower cost, there's nothing in the capitalist marketplace that says that the high-road player is going to win. So I think in some settings, the high-road player has some real advantages. In many settings, they have some real advantages. I'm just saying it's not robust. It's not robust. You can't expect the competitive process to generalize these better practices across industry. And therefore, you need to do something to block the low road. And then the question is what? Is a modest degree of regulation of a social democratic kind likely to be sufficient? And you heard me express my view that historically that doesn't seem to have been a very long-lasting solution. That countries that have tried to do that have found themselves beaten back by international competition, so forth. Does that make sense?
Is there a question related to this topic?
Yeah,
Okay, right. Go ahead.
And you are?
I'm Jeremy.
Yes.
I'm also going to be here.
Right.
So going along with that, then, do we not see these unfair competitive advantages that you're talking about that maybe the low firms employ? Do you not see them eventually catching up with those firms and then kind of biting them in the butt, or like?
Say it again, so I get your thought.
So these competitive advantages, right? These cheating methods
right.
that they have.
Right.
VW, for instance, right? Do we not see that catching up with the firms and eventually becoming a disadvantage, whereas that would never disadvantage a high-road firm?
I think so reputational effects, you're saying, might come and haunt these low-road competitors.
Right. So you're talking about how this regulation is then needed, whereas he's talking about, and I kind of agree with him, that the market would work itself out.
Right.
So
there's two types of market processes. One, I thought we were talking about in the first part of just head-to-head competition in the marketplace, but then there's also reputational effects. That firms who exploit underutilized resources in other parts of the world or domestically in our own countries might attract a lot of criticism from consumers, from activists, and so forth, and that may handicap them in that competitive race with the high-road performers. Is that where you're going?
Yeah, well, and in addition to that, then, like in VW's case, where it's not just consumers that are going to be like, oh, I don't want to buy a VW anymore. It's actual like governmental issues that they're facing, losses in share price, very black and white, negative effects.
And my assertion is simply that I don't see any reason to believe that either in the product marketplaces or in the reputational marketplace, we have reason to sit back and expect the good guys to win. I think the world is a much tougher environment than that, and there's lots of players with very sharp elbows that are doing very, very nicely, thank you very much. And it seems a bit, it's a nice idea that the good guys should come out on top, the white hats should come out ahead, but I just don't see any theoretical or empirical grounding for assuming that to be the case. I think the people who want to bet on the reputational side of this are making very strong arguments about the growing wave of consumer sentiment. All the evidence that I've ever seen tells me the consumers are only somewhat interested in these issues. Of course, they're angry at VW, right? But why? Right? Because their costs are going to go up now that they're going to change the way their engines operate. So I think it's a slim read. I don't want to be cynical. I'm just saying I don't think we should be naive. And I think I think you'd be a little bit optimistic if you imagine that the good guys always win.
Now quite a few hands are going.
Oh, sure.
Please. First and then over there.
Hi, Mark Thompson, faculty member here at the school. I'm interested in both the examples that you gave yesterday and today. Both have trade unions as part of the model. I'm interested. I mean, a lot of what you talked about today was actually voice within the production system.
Yes, correct.
And you haven't talked a lot about collective voice and collective representation. I was wondering what role that played in your model.
Yes. Well, in both cases, as you said, heavily unionized entities, Kaiser, Permanente, and NUMI, the collective representation through the union UAW at NUMI and the coalition of unions we talked about yesterday is quite central to the ability of the organization to engender the kind of trust in its workforce that would make a commitment to a no layoff commitment, a serious commitment, to give workers the sense that their concerns were going to be heard as the organization developed major strategies for expansions, for technological transformations, and so forth. And so I do think the collective voice component is crucial in these settings, in these two settings in particular, and I'm happy to generalize. I think without that collective voice, it's difficult for firms to implement these new principles that I'm talking about. Tomorrow, however, I'll be challenged to defend these same ideas in the context of a non-union setting among software engineers in a big software services organization where there's no such union, there's no union at all, there's not even a professional association. You'll tell me tomorrow, if you come back, that the labor market scarcity of these software engineers' skills gives them a certain degree of mobility that gives them a power a little akin to what a union might give them. And I think that's exactly right. That's true. I think it's true that we're likely to find these, quote, high-performance socialist models arising in settings where workers have more power. I think that's right. So
collective voice is not a necessary condition for your model to be generalizable?
I think not. If were that the case, then I would be on even weaker ground than I am already. I think not. But let's talk tomorrow. You'll tell me. You're coming back?
Yeah.
Wonderful. So you'll tell me what it thinks like. What do you think of it?
Right. Couple more questions over there.
Hi there. It's Joe from Bureaucracy Business School. Recently, I completed a field work in Toyota Astra, very similar with the in the US.
Yes.
I have done a couple of interviews with those workers, including Toyota and Honda and also Astra Auto Parts.
And where are they located?
In West Java.
Yes.
Yeah, so it's very similar. In the US, it's in California.
Yes.
Yes. In Indonesia, in West Java.
Right.
They're quite happy with the industrial relations, but there's one consensus of voice. They think that with this kind of bureaucracy and system of privatization, it seems that the protective of intellectual innovation of Toyota, it seems just being quantified in Japan, never been passed on to Indonesia or to any other emerging market, or such as in Thailand or Indonesia.
Right.
So what's your point of view? Is this could be a part of the impact of bureaucracy that Toyota apply, or what is something else?
And are they doing a full assembly, or are they working from knockdown kits?
Full assembly.
Okay. Because for a long time across most of Asia, including Australia, they were basically just building from kits. And all of this, as you say, all of the knowledge was kept in, I think it's called the International Division, or it used to be called the International Division back in Nagoya. And there was very little, as you say, knowledge imparted to the local plants or cultivated in the local plants. There was not much of this Kaizen activity happening in the plants. I think that's right. Toyota is a capitalist company. Their practices vary according to the regions and the circumstances. I'm not making an argument about Toyota. I'm finding in Toyota some instances where I think we see being enacted a new organizational principle that I'm calling enabling bureaucracy. There are many parts of Toyota where that's not where that practice, that policy, that principle is not enacted. And it sounds like you were studying one of them. So yeah, I don't want to generalize across the entire Toyota system.
The workers feel that they only know how to assemble.
Yeah,
They
right.
don't know how to
That's right. That's right.
something.
If we were talking to Toyota's leaders in the plant or back at headquarters, we might say that they're missing an opportunity, that were they to invest more in cultivating workers' ability to share ideas, develop ideas, offer more training and education about the production system, give them the tools with which to mobilize their creativity and their intelligence, that the plant could excel, the plant could perform even better. But that would be advising them on how to do a business that they seem to do pretty well at, with all, both on the high and the not so high roads that they follow in different parts of the world.
Thank you.
Tom, did you have a question?
Oh yeah, it's kind of Tom Lawrence from Saïd. It goes back to some of the political sort of end points you were getting to. I think I was feeling very optimistic at points beyond what you wanted me to feel, and then more pessimistic as you talked about the kind of need for this sort of broader social change. And then I was thinking, are you really arguing for a kind of global, transcendent kind of socialist project? Because the low road now could be in many jurisdictions.
Yes.
So I just wonder, is there room in your model or your argument for a more modest proposal?
Modesty is not my thing. I just sound modest, but no. Scratch the surface. It's a worldwide transformation we're talking about. That's right. You got my number.
So I mean, I'd like to belong to your tribe, but I don't feel like I can subscribe to global socialist transformation.
I wasn't handing out tickets yet, but come back tomorrow.
So I was wondering, is there room for some kind of more
local change?
Bounded boundaries,
Yes. Right.
something.
Right, which is a bit what Chris was pushing at when we're talking about international trade too. These are very important issues. It's complicated territory, obviously. My concern is that when we are in such a globalized market as the world has become, it's very hard for any region to erect the kind of barriers that would enable it to block the low road and develop, generalize the high road practices within its borders. There are ideas about forming clubs, so that, you might think of the European community as some such club. It doesn't seem to have done Greece much good, but in principle, the idea is an interesting one. But Europe is embedded in a global international division of labour too, and it's very hard to see how Europe can really forge a high road path, really rigorously block off the low road without indeed some more international transformation. That's one of the reasons why I like the little quotation about connecting with suppliers, including the ones overseas. I do think that one of the things that's been going on in our world is that everybody's much more connected with people in other parts of the world through all kinds of media. Mass media is one way in which we're more connected to the rest of the world, but in the workplace too. As industry becomes more globalized, workers in individual workplaces are becoming aware of suppliers and customers in other parts of the world. Those people are now have a human face for them. They're real people. They're not some archetypal other, right, that exists, far away across the ocean. They're people that I'm talking to every day on, via the internet, and they've got real concerns because the product I shipped them was too late or didn't meet their specifications, and now their boss is angry or their wife is mad because the color wasn't what she wanted. So the globalization of our sensibilities seems to me to be, again, Chris will say, stretching the point. The globalization of people's interconnectedness seems to me to be rather promising for the longer term prospects of indeed a global transformation. It's hard to see the kind of transformation getting very far if it doesn't have some global dimension to it.
Would you take just one last question at the back?
Hello, I'm Pedro from Warwick Business School as well, like Joey and Rob. I have been also working with the idea of enabling bureaucracy for my PhD, but I was working at a product development department in the aeronautic industry.
Great.
And it all seems very interesting for me. I'm familiar with your work and everything. It's just that it seems that you show mechanisms that are very classic in bureaucracy, like formalization, standardization. I just wonder that in this specific case there was anything else going on, specifically because we know that sometimes when you have more bureaucracy, you tend to have workarounds and bypasses and other ways to get things done in this new, more formalized system that not necessarily are bad, as we usually think. They're just formalized in a different way. So I was wondering if there was something like that.
You're surely right that in these settings there are many workarounds and informal adaptations that sort of enable people to bypass the strictures of the bureaucratic systems, the routines that might be too regimented in certain circumstances. What I find fascinating about these settings, though, is that those departures from the norms are often taken as signals for a rethink of what we're doing. So that I mentioned before the model change process and the way that's been standardized, the team that's responsible for that model change is not bound to implement those standards. What they are bound to is when there's an after-action review after the model change is enacted, when they've departed from those standards, they need to account for themselves to the management team that's going to come and visit and want to hear, did these procedures work? If you had to improvise, if you found them inappropriate, why, how well did it work? Let's change them for the next time. So this body of procedures is constantly evolving. Every 4 years it gets adapted as a function of the experience of the team. And again, at Toyota, you'll see, even at NUMI, it was less frequent than the plants in Japan. They are constantly changing the line speed, prompting the workers to reevaluate those standardized worksheets and looking to capture some of the new ideas that have emerged in the interstices of the regimented practices, the formalized, standardized practices. So it's a question of whether you interpret these departures from the norm as an opportunity for learning or as a whiff of freedom, right, to do what needs to be done. In many organizations, there's such a cynical attitude towards the bureaucratic apparatus that it becomes the vehicle for ossifying everything, and all the creative work happens in workarounds. I think Toyota's really interesting, at least in the plants where it seems to be operating this way, in illustrating how bureaucracy can itself become a stimulus to learning. So I'm sure the picture is mixed. There's all sorts of workarounds nevertheless, but I think the positive side is really intriguing to pinpoint.
Okay, so I think we covered a lot of ground, and from Chris Smith to Tom Lawrence, I'm not sure whether that leaves you an optimist or a pessimist, but I hope that you're hooked enough to want more to come back tomorrow. But for now, please join me in thanking Paul Adler for delivering the lecture in such an engaging way.